Hi, welcome back to Strong as You Think. Glad to have you guys back and hope all has been going well. Today, I want to talk about fearless relationships. And I think that so many times we go into the way we relate in relationships is because of some sort of fear. We are afraid of rejection. I think that ultimately that's what it comes down to, but we're just afraid of rejection. We're afraid of how others are going to respond or think of us. Sometimes we are nervous about how we are going to respond. And that makes sense. It's difficult to be rejected. But I think we have also been programmed to judge ourselves and our success in relationships on how someone else tells us we're doing or how they feel, which we think makes sense because if it's in a relationship or a connection with somebody, then we think that would be an accurate measure of ourselves on how the other person thinks or reacts. But the reality of that is that we can't control how someone else thinks or acts or feels. We can only control ourselves. So if we are judging our success on someone else, then I think we're setting ourselves up to fail. Because yes, we do have influence. And I'm not saying that we just ignore relationships and we don't try to do things to nurture them. But in the end, we can't completely judge our success in a relationship on how someone else thinks or feels, because ultimately we could be doing everything right or everything that we think should happen, be acting in all the ways that align with us, and they still might not agree and they still might not feel good. And so that's out of our realm of control. Okay. But because that's out of our realm of control, I think that's kind of scary sometimes. But if how somebody else reacts is not really the accurate judge of a relationship, then what is? And I would say the best way to judge how we show up in a relationship is we decide ahead of time the person we want to be, the ways we respond that feel aligned to us and to God or to whoever we consider as the divine, that we show up in all our relationships in a way that's consistent with that. And when I say all our relationships, I mean all of them. I'm not talking just a romantic relationship. I'm not talking just personal or family relationships. I think this can apply to any sort of connections we have with other humans. But what we have control over is how we show up. And we can do that regardless of how somebody else shows up. And that doesn't mean that I'm not talking about just turning the cheek every time and letting ourselves be in a bad position. I would actually say for most of us, that would be the opposite of that, that we would decide that we want to show up as a strong and sufficient human in relationships. And part of how we can do that is we can set boundaries. And I have a whole episode on boundaries. That's episode 13, if you want to look back and hear more about boundaries. But just briefly, setting a boundary is not to control somebody else's behavior, but it's to keep ourselves safe. It's to kind of give ourselves an opportunity to know how we are going to react if a situation gets to a place where we don't feel comfortable or we don't feel like we are aligned anymore, then we can have decided ahead of time that we are going to exit that particular situation, or what we might say in order to keep us safe and to keep us aligned with who we want to be. And what happens when we decide that ahead of time is it cuts out on some of the drama that's going on. Instead of when we approach this person, instead of worrying about what's going to happen if this, what's going to happen if they do this, when am I going to do something? That if you've decided that ahead of time, then you kind of can let that go and you don't have to think about it until it gets to that point. And I think that leaves us more open to genuine connection with other human beings. And that allows us to often show up more in the way that we decide we want to show up. And often that looks like we want to be caring, generous, kind. But I don't think that always has to mean at our expense. I think sometimes we're taught self-sacrifice and all that. And there is times that we want to sacrifice. And that's appropriate. But a lot of times we want to decide these things ahead of time so that we're not, put in a situation where we feel like our power is taken away and we're taken advantage of, that we are choosing that that's the way we want to respond. And I think that's key in showing up as who we want to be, is that we feel we've made intentional choices. And when we've made those intentional choices, we don't have to be scared of what's going to happen. We don't have to be scared of being taken advantage of. We've got boundaries and we've decided ahead of time who we want to be, how we want to show up. And we begin to trust ourselves. And it won't always happen the way we decide. I don't want you to get completely discouraged if you make a decision and you show up and you kind of fall back into an old habit. All that does is just tells us there's just some more to work on. And you can examine that and say, why did that happen this way this time? What was going on that I missed, or that I decided to fall back into that old pattern? And you did have some decision in it, which is not to beat yourself up, but to let you know that you have a choice in that. And so you have some power in making that change. Okay. So I want us to really do those things ahead of time, do that mental work, decide who we want to be, decide how we want to show up, and decide on boundaries. Like, for example, if someone says a certain thing, or if someone asks me to do something when I have something already planned, I'll say, no, thank you. I appreciate the offer. Can we schedule that for another time? Instead of just on the spot feeling like you have to say yes, or just not knowing what to say. You want to say yes, but you don't want to go back on your previous commitment. But having a plan beforehand to set a boundary of how you want to act and how you want to be true to yourself and to others will allow you to not have to make the decision in that moment. You've already made it, you've decided, and you can follow through with that. And every time you follow through with those commitments you've made to yourself, you become more trusting in yourself. And often that allows you to be more trusting in others as well. I think a lot of times it works both ways. When we have more trust in ourselves and our strength, then we trust ourselves to be with others and the way we react. And so we are able to have more open relationships with others. So I would invite you to work on deciding how you want to show up and then making those plans and or those boundaries ahead of time and seeing the freedom that that gives you going into relationships. You will have less fear and more openness when you can do this. And if you want help with that, these are things that I work on with my clients too. And feel free to message me. You can find me at Amy Elkins Coaching or Strong as You Think on our Facebook group. And you can contact me there, or my website, amyelkinscoaching.com. And we can have a free 30-minute call to talk about how that works. So this week or the next few weeks, let's really make an effort to decide how you want to show up, what your boundaries are, and then practice them. And it may not be perfect the first few times, and that's okay. But it's work worth doing. All right. Thank you. We'll see you next time.